Morning, we're actually going to be looking in Leviticus chapter 19. We got 8 more chapters to go, and I was kind of hoping to get through 2 chapters a week. Then I thought, well, we might jump over the book of Numbers, but I think we're going to go ahead and just hit some high points. So I'm going to consolidate and condense the consolidated and condensed Daniel, okay? So, because some of it's going to be a rehash, but there are a few details in there that we don't have here in Leviticus, so to kind of help us put the rest of the picture together, but I'm not going to belabor the point, okay? We'll just look at the high points and move on. So we're getting there. We're getting to the end of Leviticus. And so this morning, as we're looking at Leviticus 19, the conversation is going to basically be various laws, various commandments, various standards that God expects the children of Israel to adhere to. It's kind of interesting when you get to chapter 20 and 21, he's going to go over these same laws basically with the priests, but he's holding them to a higher standard of those laws. So I thought that real interesting, and we'll briefly look at that. Basically the same thing, but the level they're held to is a lot more stringent because of who they are. They are the priesthood. They are the figurehead, if you will, for God. It's kind of like the elders and deacons in the church today, held to a little higher standard than the general laity, okay, because of who they are and their role that they have to play. And I thought it real interesting, too, as I was reading through this. I thought about, we got all this written and it tells us all about it, and we get a picture of it. We may not have a clear understanding of how it operated. It would be real interesting to maybe step back in time and see how they made application of all this. And even the Apostle Paul was like this. Some of this has been lost in antiquity. The Apostle Paul, in writing, if he be the writer of Hebrews, which he more than likely was, said this about what we're doing here in Hebrews chapter 9. And what he's talking about was the imperfection of God's legal system, as it's often referred to. And he talked about the tabernacle, he talked about the veil, he talks about the Holy of Holies, the golden censer. And I want you to notice in verse 5 what he says about a lot of that. And over it the cherubims of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. I think the English Standard Version, maybe, I can't remember which one it is, says this, or in detail. He said, I can give you the general idea behind it, the general functioning behind it, but, the details, they're gone. It's lost in antiquity. And maybe rightfully so, because of the old that gradually was being done away with. And so by the time it got to the Apostle Paul, where was the Ark of the Covenant? Where was all this? It had been gone many centuries, okay? So this is what we run into a lot of times, that even Paul run into it a lot of times, that having a clear picture or a clear understanding of it, it may be lost in antiquity. And we know there are people that spend their entire lives in colleges and universities and archaeologists and geologists and Bible scholars studying these very things to see how the fit and the function went. But we can get too wrapped up on the mechanics and forget about what this is all about. This is a roadmap. This is how we got to Jesus Christ. This is how God prepared those people with these regulations and with these guidelines to produce seed that could bear Jesus Christ. And so that's the most important thing about it, Exactly what kind of knife they used when they put the hand on the bull to butcher it, I have no idea. Okay? How did they get all that done in a 24-hour day? Then the priest had to skin it and fillet it and do this and burn it. How did they get all that done? I don't know. I wasn't there. It's kind of lost in antiquity, Brother Griffith. You follow me? But it was done, wasn't it? Okay? And it was preparation for the coming of Jesus Christ, because we see the types and shadows. And so I thought I would kind of drop that in there in this, that maybe a lot of it we got a picture, we can kind of see it, but having that direct understanding of how it all operated and functioned, it's kind of lost. We understand what the cows did. We understand here again the mechanics. That was a transfer of sin. Something had to die for the sins of the people, didn't it? We understand that. We understand what the shedding of blood means, because life is in the blood. It took Jesus' lifeblood to secure salvation for the entire world, if people so choose it. So those parts we can understand of it, okay? And I think that's the whole point behind it. So we're going to get into some of these various laws in chapter 19. A holy standard embodying divine morals and ethics in community life. And I kind of hesitate a little bit about putting that word ethics up there, but there are things that are ethical in nature. It's the right thing to do, irregardless of the circumstances. Big part of that is your moral teaching, but you have to be careful with ethics, because that's a big collision point a lot of times between morals and ethics. And I think we used the illustration last week that a lot of times something may be ethically right, i.e., ethically it's okay to consume alcohol and get drunk, isn't it? Is it morally right? Ethically right, it's okay to go to the casinos and gamble your work paycheck away, isn't it? Is it morally right? Around the edges, sometimes it's okay to partake of something that doesn't belong to you, under the guise of whatever. But is it morally right? So you have to kind of watch this ethics thing. It can be a big collision point and stumbling block. But I went ahead and put it up there because in some of this you can kind of see that that's the idea where it's leading into with these various laws and commandments. This chapter presents a holistic vision of a community now guided by divine laws that promote fairness, respect, and love. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Is that not what today the gospel and the New Testament and the teachings of the Bible inspire today? What does it teach communities? What does it teach people about communities, about fairness and respect and love? You remove the Bible and you remove the structure and standard. Because where does the structure and standard come from? The prohibition that we just went over in a few chapters earlier about the eating of blood was nothing new. Genesis 9:4 had already told Noah that when he came out of the flood, because there's life in the flood. So these things are not new. God has packaged them up now in a law that was visible, could be read, could be seen, could be reminded, and all those things when Moses penned it, you see. So these were instructions given by God to promote fairness, respect, and love. Now, we could challenge ourselves on some of this and say, some of this has been lost, Well, why would it get lost? Because you forsook the structure, okay? You forsook the way that God intended it for it to be. It's kind of amazing about most of these laws that we've run into, except the laws of worship and the killing and shedding of blood of animals. Have they gone away? They're just written down. These things about morality, about standards, about fair weights and all like that. Where did all this come from in societies, not even not in our world, but throughout society in the world? It was structure put in place by God. And when you take away that structure, what do you lose? Well, you lose your guideline. It serves as a vivid reminder how faith, morality, and community life intertwine under God's holy mandate, inspiring us to cultivate such values in our own lives and in our communities. Boy, that says a lot, isn't it? So God has put this together for the individual to practice, but if the individual is practicing these things, what does it do for the community as a whole? People make up the community. So if you've got a group of people practicing these standards, does not your community thrive with morality? Does it not thrive with love? Does it not prosper? Yeah, sure does. God laid this down. That's why these things are so important that we study them and that we remind ourselves and we teach them to the kids and the grandkids and everybody that comes along. This is the standard. Okay, this is the structure. This is how it operates. And I know I'm going to back down and put us back to where we're at. We're in the book of Leviticus in the old Bible, okay? And this was given to them to do that. There's a lot of application on it today, isn't there? That hasn't changed. So in Leviticus chapter 19, we've got these sundry laws and things. One of the first is a reminder to be called to holiness, verses 1 through 3. Daniel, would you read that for us, please? Leviticus 19, 1 through 3.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbath. I am the Lord your God.
Okay, so what is God instructing them to be? And we see this just about at the beginning of every chapter. He's instructing them to be holy. What does the word holy mean? Simply means set apart. He wanted them to be set apart from the nations around about them. How were they going to do that? They were going to do it by not practicing pagan ideology, pagan thoughts, pagan ways, and pagan laws, okay? This is going to set them apart. They are going to be a distinct people amongst the nations around the world. So this is how it was going to be done. And I thought it really interesting right off the bat with this one. What does he talk about? Honoring father and mother, right? Well, you know, back under this particular time, you needed to fear father and mother. And I can remember a time, and I didn't live in a big community. Our nearest neighbor was miles away. But I can remember your mom and daddy a lot of times would correct you, but it wasn't unusual for your friends, mom and daddy, to correct you, you know? And it was accepted practice of that, wasn't it? Okay? So even in the neighborhoods, when this is practiced, there's a duty and responsibility across the board about that. And kids ought to honor their father and mother. And you know, the Apostle Paul said it like this to the church at Galatia. He said, you need to honor your father and mother so your days may be long. I sometimes kind of wonder if when he made that statement, if he wasn't thinking about the Jewish law, that what did they do with unruly kids under the law? Now, they couldn't arbitrarily just put them to death as we studied. They take them to the elders, don't they? They make a determination. They can either be cast out or stoned. Well, what happened most of the time? So, you know, when you stop and look at it, the Apostle Paul says, if you obey your father and mother, your days are going to be well upon this earth. It may have some relevant physical meaning to it, you know. In a general sense, if you do that today, and you don't put yourself in a high-risk category, there's a strong possibility that you're going to be a ripe old age, right? But if you get yourself put in some of these high-risk categories of life, what is very likely to happen to you? You're going to get killed, aren't you? You're going to die an untimely death, really, is what you're going to do. Who done that, God? Or did you put yourself in that because you didn't pay attention to your parents? Well, I'm going to do my old thing. I'm old fuddy duddies. They don't know what they're talking about. Okay, you can do that. But just beware. You throw a boomerang out there like that, it's coming back. And I want to tell you something. It come back a lot harder than it went around. Okay? So when you look at these verses, it has a lot of deep meaning to it. And he also said here that and right off the bat, what else does he say? Do not only honor father and mother, but keep the Sabbath, which was the Jewish day of rest. You know, that's what we call Saturday in our translation. Matthew 27 explains that pretty good when Jesus is resurrected, about when these days set apart, okay? I said Matthew 27. Let me look and see. My mind doesn't function exactly like it used to, and I'm not even 102 years old yet. Matthew 28, okay? So it does a pretty good job of explaining how that transition is made there. So with that, it's a call to holiness, isn't it? And to obey mother and father, and to keep God's Sabbath as He's instructed us to do, or instructed them to do, not us. God commands the Israelites to be holy and respect their parents, observe the Sabbath. And of course, involved in this is the refraining from idols also, and he's going to get more into that later on. Rules for sacrifices and harvest. Verses 4 through 8. Jeff, do you have Leviticus 19, verses 4 through 8?
Do not turn to idols and make yourselves any gods. For of cast metal, I am the Lord your God. And when you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, or on the day after. And anything left over on the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten all on the third day, it is tainted and will not be accepted. If anyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because it is profane. What is holy to the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from the people.
So here we're getting into the part, as I said, he's going to get into more about idols later on, but here in verse 4 it does touch on the fact not only honoring father and mother and keeping the Sabbath, but what else stands out? Idols. Turn ye not unto idols, nor make to yourselves molten gods. I am the Lord your God. So a specific instruction is given that you don't make these tangible things like the world around about you. He said you're not worshiping tangible things, you're worshiping the God of heaven. And now he's going to talk about the giving of a sacrifice, of a peace offering, and how that's to be done. Did something stand out at you in verse 5? And we've seen this before about these offerings. How was that offering to be done? Free will. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? How was our offering done today? Free will. So, you know, a lot of these principles and things have been in order for a long time, haven't they? Okay? And so we find that it's just like we're going to get into a thing here in a little bit, if we get that far down, about a man doing things with his indentured servant, a woman that he shouldn't be doing. Now, there are specific instructions that he's to do something about that sin he committed if he wants to stay in the eyes of the Lord. Now, he's got to make a sacrifice. That's not free will. You're going to do that or you get excommunicated, you know? It's kind of like today in the church. A lot of times things happen and we get things happen to us in our life and we have to make a confession, right? To make it right. The church may not know about it, but God will do the excommunicating, Matthew 13, at the judgment, won't he? When the holy angels come and he's going to take the tares out of the wheat. Okay? So we have to be cognizant of the fact, just because man doesn't see it doesn't mean we're not accountable for it. God will take care of a lot of it. Okay? Anyway, so kind of the principle is the same. And you know, really when he's talking about eating the offering, he really wanted it to be done when? The same day, didn't he? Now, under the old law, they could carry that over into the next day for various reasons and conditions because of all the sacrificing and killing they had to do and blood and all the things that had to be done. It just may work out to be that way. But the principle is, when did he want the offering to be eaten? The first day. When do we eat the offering, if you will? Today. The first day. Okay? It's not acceptable any longer because we have that opportunity to eat it on Monday, is there? Or Tuesday. And I know there are congregations within the church that do kind of like the Catholic Church, that it's not very prevalent around here, but it goes on to where when they have a funeral, guess what they do? They have the Holy Eucharist, as it's called. And there are churches of Christ that do. When they have a wedding, guess what some will do? Where do you get that from? Well, Herbert Keith used to say, I know exactly the book and chapter they got it from. The 33rd chapter of their imagination. That's man's doing it. But the principles of God looks like still the idea and thought behind it is still there. And he said that if you don't eat it within the specified time, it is an abomination. How about that? So you just can't arbitrarily go and eat and partake of the feast that's pertaining to your sacrifice. He's pretty specific about that. Can we do it arbitrarily today, or are we specifically instructed on the first day of the week? Well, Jeff, I'd like to do it on Tuesday. Be just as good, same bread, same fruit of the vine. What's it going to hurt? We still remembering the Lord. You see how man's knowledge, how man's wisdom interjects into all of this? Well, it's very simply put. God said to do it when? First day of the week. So, how many first day of the weeks are there? One. Okay? So, it gets pretty much self-explanatory when you look at it. And it was punishable that if you did not do that, you're profaning the higher things of God, and you could be excommunicated or put out of the camp. And we know that as we read back into this, it could get to the point to where if you kept on with it and you didn't heed to that law, what would they do to you? Stone you, wouldn't. So these things are serious in the eyes of God. They're not to be taken lightly. Now, any of you brethren have any comment on this so far? I know I've been going 90 to nothing. I've probably spent too much time already on
the spiritual side of that law, but also eating it on the first and second day would be a physical side, because it's going to make you sick. They didn't have refrigeration.
Right. Well, yeah, there's various reasons.
Because you're sick.
Yeah, well, right, yeah. I mean, there's various reasons for it. And, it's kind of like what you said. The spoilage rate, everything else. But, you have to look at the volume of work that's done in this too, right? So God has always given man what? An opportunity to do what? Worship Him. He just didn't kick them out in the cold. It's just that man's fallacy is he doesn't take that opportunity, does he? Okay? So anyway, very good, Jim. I appreciate that. God provides guidelines for peace offerings and harvest, instructing that gleaning should be left and the poor and things like that. And we're fixing to get into that. It's the next thing that God has even made preparation, like we've seen before, in these things happening. Verses 9 through 16. Reed, do you have that?
Now when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap the very corners of the field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, nor drink falsely, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind. But you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great. But you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. You are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord.
So, as we see here, a lot of this is kind of self-explanatory, isn't it? Because these are things that we still practice in principle today, isn't it? One of the things that jump out at you, remember God's made a provision even for those that are without, if you will, or are not economically inclined, like the next person or whatever. What were they supposed to do with their fields? They were to leave part of it, wasn't it? They didn't completely glean the fields because they left a part so the poor would have an opportunity to eat. And notice something else in this too that you're starting to see prop up kind of regular. What about the stranger in the land? What about those that are sojourning through? Well, God's going to expect them, the children of Israel, to conduct with them like they would among themselves. But they were not allowed to let the sojourner bring in those heathen practices. If the sojourner wanted to stay in good standings with the church, then he's got to abide by the guidelines, i.e. the Bible, that the church practices. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Do we not do things similar today? There are sojourners that come through visiting, aren't they? Sometimes they're not members of the church, are they? Do we extend to them the same hospitality and well-doing that we do everybody else? But if the sojourner happens to come back into the congregation of God's people and say, hey, I visited with y'all, I like coming here, but y'all need to add instrumental music, and I'd come regular. Well, do we change the law of God to fit the sojourner's pagan practices? No. No. But are they to be treated like we treat anybody else? Yes. How are you going to draw them in if you don't? You know? If you come at them in a fighting mode, what are you doing here? We don't do that here. Well, most people don't understand what they do in the first place. Okay? You know, a lot of times being an observer, and I've done this myself in meetings and all, up north and around about, just kind of sit back sometimes and observe. Be surprised at what you learn. You know? So he's going to expect that of them. So even the sojourner that comes to the land is allowed to glean of what you have produced. He's allowed to partake of the goodness of God, okay? And so we find that was one of the things that jumped out at me. Verse 11 kind of jumps out. You shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie one to another. General principle, right? Okay? That's been there for a while, hasn't it? You don't swear falsely, neither shall thou profane the name of God. Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor. There's fraud coming into being, okay? Yeah, you don't do that. You don't curse the deaf and put a stumbling block before the blind. All those people are not useful to society. We need to get rid of them. Well, how do we know they aren't angels God has sent before us to minister, for us to minister unto? So you can kind of get into this thing, and it makes you stop and think about what's going on here as a people and as a community. You shall not do any unrighteous judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, having respect to persons. So this person comes in, Jesus had to teach the Pharisees and Sadducees about that. People come into the synagogue or into the temple, and they're highly known in the community, and they're dressed in the latest attire. We want you to have our front seat here. Whereas when the poor man come in and he didn't meet what their earthly standards were, we can't have this guy sing. We'll just park him back in the back somewhere. We'll put him back there with Greg. How about that? Go ahead, just kid.
One congregation, poor man came in, sat down, and the preacher stopped in the middle of the sermon and told him to leave.
See, that's not what we're about. Is how you going to draw people in. See, what we have to remember about Israel, and we'll get into this later on, we don't stop and think about what was their one duty that they were supposed to fulfill to God. What was this all about? They were put in place to give God the glory in a pagan world. What do we put in place for today? If God gets any glory, where does it come from? The church, doesn't it? If there's be any goodness seen in the world, where does it come from? The church, doesn't it? That's why our standards as members of the church, we're held to a higher standard, a lot higher standard than the world. Because if we look like the world, and we talk like the world, and we act like the world, then we must be a Christian, right? Well, that don't meet the litmus test, does it? I don't care what the world says. I'm an old farm boy from way back when. All I know is if it walked like a chicken, it dressed like a chicken, and it clucked like a chicken, guess what you got? You got a chicken. Now, they may tell you it's a turkey and all this kind of mess and that it don't matter, but it does matter. Okay? So, anyway, these are some of the general laws and things that he has laid down. He goes into about being a talebearer about things. So, there's a whole lot of sundry commandments and laws and things like that that's given in this chapter. Ethical conduct and justice, we just read about some of that. Come on. God calls for honesty, fair treatment of neighbors, fair judgment, and warns against slander, endangerment, and hatred. A commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself is introduced. You know? So we're going to see that being taught on somewhat a good bit in the New Testament, isn't it? About loving one's neighbor, okay? As oneself. So. Agriculture and textile laws, verses 17 through 19. Morton, you got that?
You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear a grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind. You shall not sow your fields with mixed seed, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you.
Okay, so here we're getting into actually, and the way I've done it, I tried to break this out so we could kind of look at it from a broke out standpoint, even though some of this bleeds over together because it is sundry laws. One of the things that jump out at you in verse 17 is what? Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thine. And we've heard this before, haven't we? The heart. You know, where did God expect these sacrifices and all to come from? Well, I got to sacrifice this old cow because God wants me to do that. Or was it, hey, it's time for me to do my sacrifice. I need to go out there and pick out my best flock, and I need to do my sacrifice. Where does it all come from? The heart, doesn't it? You know, so the heart concept of spirituality was not foreign in the Old Testament. You know, a lot of times we think only the carnal side of it, but there was a lot of spirituality side of it too that went along with it, okay? In our self-consciousness, if you will, about ourself, about our thought attitudes, right? The free will offering, is that an issue? It's kind of like what Reed said in that. I thought that was a very interesting point. It's not a matter of how many clothes you got on or how many clothes you take off. It's a matter of the heart. If your heart's right with God, then you know the appropriate thing to do is dress, right? So what does it all boil back down to? The heart, doesn't it? And even back then, there was special consideration for the heart. And so we find too, now he's going to get into the statute. Notice he didn't even want their cattle to do what? To interbreed. I thought that was kind of interesting. He wanted his people and his possessions, if you will, to be what? Pure. What we call kosher today, I guess. And he gives specific, even about the cattle, he wanted their cattle to be distinct and separate and apart of the cattle that was in the world around about them. Now, you know, generally what that does is if you have a particular breed of cattle and you contain that within that particular breed, more often than not, you're going to get a healthier breed as time rocks on. This is why he's going to give instructions about when you plant your fruit trees, the first 3 years you plant them, you don't harvest the fruit. You're going to give them time to nurture and grow and get strong and develop. Okay? Kind of the same principle, right? And I thought even in the clothing, he didn't want their clothing to be intermingled either. And he didn't want their fields to become what we call today hybrid fields. You plant wheat, guess what I want? I don't want wheat and something mixed, because that's a contaminant, isn't it? It's not the true product, is it? When you plant barley, guess what I want? I want the true barley. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? And that would set their crops and all aside because there's no, today I think we call even in agriculture, there's no genetic engineering going on, okay? Because, you know, man has found too, a lot of times dealing with genetic engineering, he gets in a lot of trouble with that. It don't always turn out like you think it does, okay? So anyway, God has given those specific instructions about that. And even their clothing is to be set apart. He's even going to get into about their haircuts. I thought that was interesting. If we get that far, I've spent way too much time. God forbids crossbreeding livestock, sowing fields with two kinds of seed, and wearing clothing made of two kinds of material. So he wanted all his stuff to be pure, didn't he, so to speak, if you want to put it in that terminology. Punishment for sin and fruit tree laws. I thought that was kind of interesting. Verses 20 and 22. Eric, would you read that?
Whoever lies carnally with a woman who is betrothed to a man is a concubine, and who has not at all been redeemed or given her freedom. For this there shall be scourging, but they shall not be put to death because she was not free. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord, to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. A ram is a trespass offering. The priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering before the Lord for a sin which he has committed. And the sin which he has committed shall be forgiven.
Okay, kind of interesting about verse 20. And I'm going to skip down. I'm going to show you some different translations about it. You see kind of a transition here in the phraseology here. It talks about a man lying carnally with a woman. And when you look at that, it's talking about a bondservant girl or an indentured servant, okay? But when you look at this a little closer, it talks about her being scourged, but they won't be put to death. They is used one place, but she spelled out in particular about the scourging. So when you stop and think about it, kind of seems unfair, doesn't it? Okay? So you go back and look, and we talked about indentured servants. God has put a lot of regulations on masters and indentured servants. We went through all that. They're treated with respect and kindness and due and all like that, okay? God has always looked out for the underprivileged, if you will, okay, in this way. So what about that? But it looks like when you take a look at this is two consenting adults that then got themselves caught in a situation, okay? If you go and look at other translations of this and why they use she there instead of they like other translations, I don't know. I'm not versed enough in the Hebrew and the Greek to do that word play like some of you brethren may can do it. I'm not versed enough in doing it. But what I noticed is this, and I'm going to skip on down to that slide. Well, I say I am. I put another new battery in the clicker, so it must not be the battery. I'm getting you another clicker. Verse 20 kind of makes you scratch your head when you stop and think about the big picture of what we study and all about God's plan, doesn't it? Well, so let's look and see. You know, it does kind of, like this guy here, I'm not going to get through with this. I'll be lucky to get through with that. That's on me. I talk too much. Imagine that, Reed. So when you look at some of the other translations that is recognized as good translations of the Bible, this is how they read. Here's the American Standard Version. And whosoever lieth carnally with a woman that is a bondmaid betrothed to a husband, she's betrothed, she's not yours, but y'all got together, and not at all redeemed, now freedom given her, they shall be punished. They shall not be put to death. So they actually pull the specified she out of that, and they go to they, just like it does in the bottom of that verse. It lumps them both together about not being put to death, okay? The New King James Version, whosoever lies carnally with a woman who is betrothed to a man has a concubine, and who has not been at all redeemed, now given her freedom, for this there shall be scourging, but they shall not be put to death. So you got two guilty parties. What's it taking on the appearance of? You got two consenting adults that got themselves caught, right? What it takes on the appearance of. The English Standard Version, if a man lies sexually with a woman who is a slave assigned to another man and yet not ransomed or given her freedom, a distinction shall be made. They shall not be put to death because she was not free. So it looks like the term they should have been used there. It's kind of like we run into a lot of times the context dealing with the King James Version on different words. Hell is used to denote several different aspects of life, and so you have to look at the context and what's going on. We went through this with the term, the King James Version uses corn when it talks about wheat and barley. I thought that kind of interesting because corn was really a foreign thing to them. Corn didn't get into that area of the country until the Europeans brought it back into Europe during the conquest and the exploration of South America and Mexico. And I was looking at something about that last night too. There was a thing that come up on television about that, and they brought that out too, about where maize and tomatoes and things like that were primarily an American, if you will, including South America, food. So what did that mean? As we studied that, we began to realize that a lot of times they used the term kernel or corn to refer to the grains of wheat or the grain of barley. It's a kernel, okay? But for some reason, the King James Version said corn, okay? But when you look at that, you do find that even in some areas of Scotland and Britain and places like that today, when they say corn, you have to be careful. They may not be talking about maize, okay? So you run into that sometimes, so you have to look at the big picture. That more fits with what is going on here, because God is not a partial God. He's a fair God. So it looks like these folks got themselves in some hot water, is what it looks like. Because if she was not consenting, then what does it become? Then what happens to him? If you remember, you go right on out to camp and do what? They stoned him. Okay? So it looks like that's what's going on here in this setting. So I got about 2 minutes. I don't think I can do anything in 2 minutes. Daniel, I'm going to buy another clipper Monday next week just for the sake of it, because this is a new battery in this one. So we find these things that God had provided for, instructions for a man who sins with a slave girl, introduces laws about planting of the fruit trees next. And that's probably where I'm going to stop right there, is in verse 22. God is he's pretty specific about them giving a trespass offering. Then the man giving a trespass offering for his sin to get forgiveness and things of that nature. So he did it. They got caught. A trespass offering had to take place. So that's pretty specific. Any of you brothers got any comments right quick before I close this out? Okay, we'll get ready for the worship service.